Hello and welcome to our second installment of our two-part series on writing literature reviews. The focus of this session is on structuring and writing your literature review. So this is our focus for today's session. We're going to first considering some of the more common structures that are used when organizing a literature review. And then we're going to take a look at some quite simple to use writing techniques that you can start implementing so that you are foregrounding synthesis in your text and also establishing a nice flow for your readers. Now, in our previous session, we spent a bit of time considering the purpose, the role, the function of a literature review, which really centers on this consolidation of the academic conversation. In simple terms, communicating what is both known as well as what is not known about a given topic. So providing that overview of what scholars are currently discussing. And if your literature review is there to support or justify your own project, then it has that function as well. And the literature review is very much characterized by a synthesis of many different sources, pulling them into a cohesive narrative that frames the topic that you are focusing on in writing that text or pursuing that project. So let's take a look first at some common structures. We're going to look at three in total, and also consider a variation that a variation of one of these structures, depending on why you are writing the literature review in the first place. So those multiple structures will share some commonalities. There will be some overlap when examining one in relation to the other. And my recommendation to you, my advice to you, is choose the one that makes the most sense from your perspective. So what serves the nature of the project that you're working on or the topic that you're working on, and also coming back again and again and again to this question of which one is going to serve your readers' needs the best. Because that's what we are crafting this text for. It's for someone else to read, to reflect on, to learn something. So what is the structure that is going to help walk your reader through the text that you have pulled together? So the first structure, and we're going to look at sort of two variations of the structure, frames it from the research from a very narrative perspective. So considering the literature review as a story, where it is the approach is almost conversational in style. It's not to say that the writing itself would be casual and conversational, but the approach in the way that you are thinking of how you might address certain ideas, it's almost like entering that conversation with someone else. So you could ask and answer these questions. What inspired my research? So if someone was to ask you that question, you can imagine that they're asking it and you would explain what your inspiration was. Next, how does my research relate to what's been done before? Why does my research matter? What will my research achieve? And lastly, who will my research impact? Now, these questions are very much centered on the idea that the literature review is providing context for a research project. But if you are writing a literature review as a sort of standalone text or as an assignment, then the variation might make more sense. So here we're asking almost the identical questions, but we're just framing them around more of a research question as opposed to a research project. So that first question is the same, what inspired, or very similar, what inspired my research question? Next, how does my research question relate to what's been done before? Why does my research question matter? What could related research achieve? So if you were to speculate a little bit or hypothesize a little bit as to how people could explore this research question, then you might want to surface that in your literature review. And then lastly, who would be impacted by related research. So again, if a research study was taken on, did unfold based on your research question, who would that have implications for? All right, our next structure frames the literature review as a form of argumentation. So if you're someone who likes to have a debate, or you really want to anticipate potential criticisms and critique, then this might be a structure that appeals to you. So again, you can sort of follow this in order, similar to that first structure. But how you are arranging information, how you're approaching information might be a little bit different. So we can begin by stating very simply what we know or where there is agreement, what we don't know or where there is disagreement, why the topic or question is worth investigating. So really making a case for the value or the importance of the topic or question. That is the basis of the review. And then considering some of those different elements of the sources that you are pulling into your review. So interrogating the research design, asking what existing research reveals about how the topic or question can best be investigated. So what kind of methodology is being used to justify or to explore rather those research questions or those topics. And lastly, what existing research may predict about the answer of an unanswered question. So really stating some sort of hypothesis about either your research project or maybe someone else's future research that they could do in order to try and figure out the answer to an unanswered question. All right, and our third and final structure is referred to as or described as create a research space, otherwise known as the CARS model. And this is a very generic but flexible structure that can be used by almost any discipline, almost any writer who is looking to organize their literature review. So the steps are as follows. First, we establish the research territory. We identify a gap of knowledge, and then we take occupation of that gap. So it's almost looking for a bit of treasure on a treasure map, and then identifying where we might surface some new knowledge as a result of the research that we can undertake. So we're going to take a look at an example of CARS in practice. And as we read through, I would encourage you to reflect on how the author or the authors have made use of these CAR moves. So what are you noticing in terms of when these moves seem to be implemented in the text? So as a reminder, we have that first move of establishing the research territory. Another way of thinking about that, what's already been done. Next, identify the gap, otherwise what hasn't been done. And lastly, occupy the gap. What am I doing? What is my research going to do, or what could my research do to address this lack of knowledge around this particular topic? So for context, this is the topic under investigation. So it is taken from the article, Designing Enjoyable Motion-Based Play Interactions with a Small Humanoid Robot. And essentially the authors, the researchers are asking this question: how can designers intentionally develop companion robots that promote joy during motion-based play? So that is the question under investigation. And this is how they have engaged with some of the research in their literature review. So let's read through. And as we're reading, take some time to start seeing, hey, where are those CAR moves, those CARS moves? Am I seeing that the authors are largely following this form of organization? So the text reads as follows. Designing a robot capable of providing enjoyment and playful interactions involves making decisions with regard to embodiment, sensing capability, behaviors, and interaction strategy, what a robot should do and when. Many previous achievements have addressed the first three: embodiment, sensing capability, and behaviors. Robots have been modeled on humans, for example, EMA, QRIO, Jingle Bell Rock Santa, My Real Baby, Now, and Robo Sapien. Pets such as dogs, ABO, cats, Dreamcat, extinct or rare creatures such as dinosaurs, Pleo, or seals, Paro, and toys such as teddy bears, Huggable, or balls, Roball. One highly successful design, ABO, can see, hear, and feel touch and features over 1,000 behaviors. What has not been described is how such sense input and behaviors can be associated to provide enjoyment. Some general principles have also been suggested which could be important in designing a playful interaction with the robot: lifelikeness, robustness, rhythm, and timing and delays. These general principles, however, do not indicate requirements for a robot's behavior during an interaction, which, if unsatisfied, could result in failure to provide enjoyment, i.e. an interaction strategy for enjoyment. What has been missing was a clear reference specifically targeting enjoyment, which tells a designer what to do and what not to do when developing a companion robot for play. The new contribution of this article is that it reports general guidelines for how to structure an interaction for enjoyment, which are tested via experiment. With this knowledge, it becomes possible to know how to design a robot which can participate enjoyably in motion-based play. All right, so take a moment, pause the video if you'd like, and consider, hey, where are these cars moves? How have the authors made use of them in this piece of text? All right, so let's take a closer look. So what we'll notice when really digging into the text is that where we have a lot of those citations, we start getting a sense of, hey, this is the information that is currently known about this particular topic. And this awareness of previously obtained information or discovered information is also reinforced through some of the language choices, which I've bolded and occasionally underlined. So we have this kind of phrasing: many previous achievements have addressed. So what we know as readers that, okay, we're referencing the work of other scholars here. And then as we continue, one highly successful design. So here we have one study or one design rather that is being highlighted in order to bring a bit of additional information to the unique nature of this particular robot because of its complexity in this instance. And then as we continue into the next paragraph, that phrasing, some general principles have also been suggested. This is, again, referencing the breadth of work that other people have already done in relation to this topic. So we have sort of a combination of language choices as well as citations to really help clearly delineate that information that is currently known. Now, when the authors are making reference to other information, we tend to see fewer citations as they start bringing their own perspective to the topic. In identifying research gaps, we're also making use of very direct, clear language so that our reader isn't left with any ambiguity in terms of understanding where those gaps are. In this instance, we have sort of two areas where gaps are emerging. Often we might just have one area, but again, this is speaking to some of the flexibility of this structure. So some of the language, again, that's being used is making it very, very clear that there are some research or knowledge gaps. So for instance, in that first paragraph, what has not been described? This is a very clear indication that we lack some information when thinking about this topic. And that sort of clarity continues in the second paragraph. These general principles, however, do not indicate and then we have this reference to what has been missing. So this is a very clear way of making reference to a knowledge gap. And then as the literature review starts to come to a conclusion, we have reference to how this research project, this research question is helping to address or fill that gap. Here we have that very clearly stated through the language that is chosen. The new contribution of this article is that it does this. And then it follows with an explanation of how the project has been designed and the reason why it has been designed that way. All right, now when it comes to how you're going to format your literature review, depending on your discipline, there may be expectations of having headings or no headings. There is also variation depending on the style guide that you follow, as well as just the nature of the literature review. If you have a standalone long literature review, it's going to be more common to have those headings, just so that at a glance, your reader will have a really good sense of the various themes or sub-themes that you'll be addressing in the literature review. Other times, though, if you have a shorter literature review, especially if it's part of a larger write-up of a project that you've done, you may not need those headings, or they will not be required, or they may just not be conventional in your field. So there is variation. Just on a personal note, I think it can be quite useful to have headings when you are working on your first draft of your literature review, just to help keep things organized for yourself. But you don't want the organization of your literature review to be dependent on those headings. So what I mean by that is that you should be able to remove the headings, and the prose should still move nicely between those sub-themes. So really paying attention to moments of transition when you're moving from one theme to the next, making sure there's a natural segue there, and that if you are including a heading, it really is almost a bonus element that just adds some visual clarity to the text that you are producing. Now, when it comes to introductions, introductions may be separate or integrated with your literature review. Again, part of this will be informed by the context. So if you're preparing something for a course, for instance, you'll receive some direction from your instructor or your professor, whereas if you are working on a literature review that's part of an article that maybe you'd like to publish in something like the undergraduate research journal, maybe you would have a separate introduction. So again, you're going to want to be mindful of the context of whether or not that introduction should be separate or integrated. Regardless, there always will be an introduction. It just might not be obvious at first glance, especially if it is integrated into that literature review. The length of an introduction will be very dependent on context as well. It will reflect the length of the overall text that's being produced. So shorter text obviously will have shorter introductions. So with that in mind, an introduction could be anywhere from 1 to 6 paragraphs potentially. If you're working on a project that is, 10 pages in length, it may be that your introduction would be no more than 2 paragraphs, for instance, just to maintain that sense of proportion. But the introduction has some really valuable functionality in that it is, as it suggests, acting as that moment of introduction to the topic. And so it's a matter of helping to ease your reader in to the the larger text, so that they not only have a broad sense of the topic in question, they'll also have a sense of its relative importance, and they'll also gain some insight into the primary focus of the paper that you have produced. So again, depending on how you are organizing this information, you might include reference to the research parameters, different constraints that you encountered or that you placed on the project. You might have definition of terms. So there are different elements that can be incorporated into an introduction. So let's take a look at quite a short introduction. So this one is just 2 paragraphs. So we'll see how you can have a very developed introduction that doesn't have to be too long. It really is about easing us into the topic so that we have a sufficient basis for understanding the literature review that we're going to be reading next. So this introduction is taken from Why Robots? A survey on the roles and benefits of social robots in the therapy of children with autism. And it reads as follows. Autism is a developmental disorder that encompasses a large variety of disorders with impairments in social relationships, communication, and imagination, and with the severity and nature of the symptoms varying from one individual to another. Autism is a lifelong disorder for which no cure has yet been found. With early intervention, much can be done to improve the quality of the life of those who are afflicted. Several therapeutic approaches have been attempted over the years. However, due to the nature of the disorder and the large variations in the symptoms, no single approach can be established as the best one, since a therapy model that may work well with one child may not work well at all with another. In this survey, we present the emerging works on social robots in the therapy of children with autism. We first give an overview of autism and its rate of occurrence in many countries in the world. Next, we describe each robot's features and their respective effects on a child with autism. We then highlight the behaviors that the robots were tasked to evoke from a child. Finally, we discuss the roles and the therapeutic benefits of social robots for children with autism. The present account was intended to provide introductory level information for robot designers, popularize clinicians and parents of children with autism with the recent developments in robot technologies and how these can be helpful in therapy. So if we start breaking this introduction down, we'll start to see the following structure emerge. And this structure is often described as a general to specific structure. And this is probably the most conventional way of approaching any introduction in an academic context, but really any context apart from fiction. So we begin with a broad overview of the disorder. So a broad definition of autism. We move on to the treatment or the interventions that we might and how that impacts this disorder. So emphasis placed on early intervention. But then we have this problem that is identified in that right now it's quite difficult to find the best intervention just because of the variability of this disorder and the many different ways that it can manifest. And then we start becoming more self-referential in terms of identifying the structure of the paper and conclude with some reference to the purpose of the paper. So with this kind of structure, your reader will have sufficient knowledge to start understanding the implications of the literature review. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, or maybe surprisingly, you might notice some commonalities with those cars moves that we reviewed previously. So we begin with broadly what is known. We don't have any citations here, but you might have some citations of your own in your own introduction. Then we have what is not known, so that problem or that area of concern, that question that we have as it relates to this topic. And then This is where there's a bit more of a divergence from the cars as they relate to a literature review. Here we have reference to what will be known after reading this particular paper. Whereas if we're making use of cars in an introduction, that what will be known is usually in relation to a research project that has been undertaken. All right, so now we're going to shift focus a little bit, and we're going to look at this topic of synthesis. So this is a little bit of a review from the first part of our two-part series, but I encourage you to take a moment, read through this piece of text on your own, pause the video, read through, and reflect on what you like or don't like about this piece of writing. So take a moment, pause the video. What do you like or not like about this piece of text? So a lot of people, when they encounter reference to this piece of text, they might identify some positive things. They might note that, well, the information is presented in a chronological way. So that's useful to see how things have developed or changed over the years. In this instance, a change over the course of 5 years. And so that will have a certain amount of value. So it's not that this piece of text is the worst piece of writing that you'll ever encounter, because you might think, hey, it has some value in terms of presenting information in this chronological way. However, when you were reading, did you also find that the text was highly repetitive? And was it repetitive to the point of it becoming distracting to you? And if that's the case, that is an indication to us that our writing hasn't been very successful, because the same reactions that we have when we are reading someone else's writing, it's something that we want to develop this awareness of, so that we don't accidentally replicate things that we don't like as readers into our own text when we are writing that text. So it's about cultivating that awareness so that we are able to really consider what adds value for our reader. And when we look at this example, there's a little bit of value perhaps, but not a lot. As readers, we really have to sift through a lot of information that might have been more effectively synthesized. So this is something that we briefly looked at in part 1 of this series, but I wanted to return to it simply because it is such a common occurrence in literature reviews, where we have just a summary after summary after summary in looking at that review. And it sort of makes sense in that we have been reviewing all of these different sources, all of these different studies. And so if we are summarizing them, it's because it's demonstrating our opinions around how these sources might be equally relevant. But readers are expecting us to go a little bit further in engaging with that research that we've done. And so one of the ways in which we can do that is to try and better frame the sources in relation to their connection with one another. So let's take a minute, or a few minutes rather, take some time, read through this piece of text. Feel free to pause the video and consider, what do you like or dislike about this piece of text? And so once you've had a bit of time to read through and think, then question, how does this one compare with that other example? So pause the video. What do you like or dislike about this piece of text? All right, so with this example, people often respond more favorably compared to our first example, simply because there is a greater sense of narrative coming through. And because of that sense of narrative, our readers are going to have a more informed understanding of the complexity of the broader academic conversation. And we also have a slightly stronger sense of voice because the writer has taken the time to really sort through and figure out all these relationships in order to present it to their reader in this considered way. So when we are discussing possible benefits of synthesis, this is often what we are discussing. This idea of what information is really valuable for my readers and how can I present it to them in a way that they are going to engage with that information and not become distracted because they find that they are encountering reference to the same thing over and over and over again. So if we take a closer look, we see how we have some reference to that broad overview of the academic conversation. So we have reference to several studies, for instance. We have reference to these novel interventions. So we have a sense of the scope broadly of the research that has been done and has been presented to our readers. And then we have some clustering or grouping of sources in shared parentheses or a sort of group citations where appropriate. So, for instance, when we're referencing those enhanced social and communication skills, that very similar information comes from both that 2016 Moyle and Bramble study, and it's very similar to the 2019 study. So we can put those studies quite closely together to show how we have a sense of agreement among multiple scholars that, yes, this is a shared benefit or shared outcome as it relates to this particular intervention. So once you build awareness of synthesis, you'll often see it in all literature reviews. It's a key characteristic of any literature review in any discipline, really. The way in which the information has been synthesized may be different, but there's still an expectation of this blending of this pattern recognition, regardless of your area of study. So here we have lots of synthesis in action. It's being communicated in a slightly different style just because of the citation style that has been used. So making use of numbers instead of author date, for instance. So it creates a bit of a cleaner look. And this is often useful in disciplines where you might have a very high expectation in terms of the number of studies that are referenced in a literature review, where some disciplines are encourage more judicious use of sources and require fewer sources in the review. But to break this down a little bit, so we have in purple, I've identified where we have a concept or a detail being referenced. And whenever we have this sort of specialized bit of information, then we are going to support it with our references. And almost without exception, there's two instances where that concept or that detail in this example are being supported with just one example. The rest of them have two or more studies that are being referenced in order to help frame the information. We have a little bit of critique layered in. And this is also often an expectation in literature reviews, where you are bringing your own reading, your own engagement to the text, and are surfacing areas of potential concern. So a very common way of incorporating critique is to consider if there are questions that have yet to be asked, or if there are issues with research design. So if you're noticing these things, you'll definitely want to surface them in your literature review. And toward the end of this excerpt, we see that there is one instance where one source, one study, has been identified with more detail. And this, again, reflects some disciplinary variation. So some disciplines, you would often have single studies highlighted in order to provide more detail. Other times, the single studies are going to be used a little bit less commonly, but they could serve one of two functions. It could either be used very effectively to indicate a study is representative of a larger group of studies, for instance, or it might be that it's being identified because it's a bit of an outlier and it's done things that other scholars haven't thought of, or maybe it has surfaced information that's quite new and interesting in the field. So you always have this option where when you're synthesizing, you can still pull in more detail when it's relevant, when you really want to highlight something of note in a given study or some particular studies. So it's always about trying to figure out, again, what information does your reader need? Can we focus more on those commonalities, those relationships? And when is it necessary to provide more detail so that they have a really good understanding of that overall conversation? All right, so our last point of focus for today's session concentrates on writing techniques and really considering how we can make use of language and different strategies to ensure that readers are remaining engaged with what we are trying to share with them. It's always a challenge to maintain someone's interest. So when it comes to writing, we might ask ourselves, well, how do I create a readable piece of prose? We might ask ourselves, what strategies are available to us as writers? And lastly, how do I help immerse readers in my writing? So these are questions that you'll likely have to puzzle over because they often relate to the development of your scholarly voice. And when it comes to developing this sort of authoritative style of writing, it takes time. It takes time because often when we are reading for content. So one way in which we can develop as writers is to start paying attention to the style of writers in our field, especially those writers who we find easier to read. So what kind of techniques are they using? And how can we make use of those techniques in our own writing? And going through this process, it might seem a little bit odd if you're not used to reading for the writing itself. But the more you do it, the more aware you become of different tips and strategies you can make use of and incorporate into your own text. And it's a good skill to develop simply because developing this genre awareness can make it easier to meet deliverable expectations. And this is a skill that transfers beyond academia. It's something that you'll find if you're working in a corporate environment, if you're working in a nonprofit environment. So the style of writing might be different, but in training yourself to be aware of what the expectations are of a certain type of document, it becomes easier with practice. All right, so here we have a piece of text from the Canadian geographer, and we'll read through it together. And as we're reading through it, again, I would encourage you to ask the same question that you've asked a couple of times during this workshop. What do you like or dislike about a piece of writing? Again, the reason why I like to ask this question is so that you can start determining for yourself which strategies appeal to you more than others, so that you can really focus on incorporating these strategies into your own writing, so that you're going to make text that you are satisfied with and that will be clear and engaging for your readers. So this excerpt reads as follows. One of the major barriers to widespread implementation of land-based learning in Indigenous education is that it does not readily contribute to capitalistic goals such as economic profit. The economy that we work within benefits from the displacement of Indigenous peoples, specifically in areas where resource exploitation is rampant. This concept is thoroughly explained in relation to land-based learning by Noah and Healy. While these capitalistic exploitative practices are contrary to Indigenous values of reciprocal relationships with the land, Indigenous peoples end up engaging with capitalism in order to secure the resources necessary to run a land-based learning program. Even the conceptualization of land-based learning as a program is a westernized way of thinking. The idea of program is rooted in Western funding and definitions of organization. So what do you like or dislike about this piece of writing? So take a moment, think about how you're responding to the style of writing. And then we'll take a moment and we'll start breaking this piece of text down. So if you are someone who really liked this style of writing and you liked it for various reasons, then it might be that you're responding to a very specific technique that was used in this text. So what we see here is an example of the old new information technique in action, where the premise is quite simple. We take previously shared information from a preceding sentence and we place it at the beginning of the next sentence before providing new information. Don't worry, we're going to go through this in detail. But this is often a very appealing way of organizing information, especially in the English language. And so having knowledge of this technique can be very useful for you as you are focused on crafting and revising your literature review, to think about how you might establish a sense of flow or readability for your audience. So as I've noted, the old new information technique is a very appealing structure in the English language. It's common, it's powerful, and it's very simple because the premise is that it makes the connections between sentences very, very strong and obvious. As noted previously, we take old information and we place it at the beginning of our new sentence, and then we put new information after that in order to shift the focus of the sentence. And like we saw in our example, we can sustain this pattern across entire paragraphs. And in doing so, really create a nice sense of flow for our readers. So if we were to take a little excerpt from that larger paragraph, we can start to break it down in order to really see this old new information technique in action. So in looking at this, what old information would you say is carried into the second sentence? So we have in this example some strategic repetition because we are making reference to relationships in our first sentence and relationships at the beginning of our next sentence. So it's a way to create a little bit of overlap, a little bit of linkage between these two sentences. Now, we don't have to rely exclusively on repetition in order to make this technique work. One way that we can still make use of the old new information technique is by using a structure that in the following way, making use of this or these plus a noun. So this is very useful when referencing a concept, for instance. If we look at this example, Sykes and Wilson found that short bursts of intense exercise showed more benefits than longer but less intense workouts. This finding is consistent with those of other researchers. So, what might be a benefit of this approach? Well, it is going to help us to reduce some wordiness and avoid some needless repetition. Repetition can be very useful when it's done intentionally, but if we are making use of it all of the time, then it can just become a little bit distracting, even overwhelming for our readers. A point of caution, as with most strategies or techniques, we need to be mindful of how they can be misused. And one possible misuse of this sort of structure is the potential for pronoun confusion. So if we were to read through these examples, we might ask ourselves, is a problem emerging here? What is the problem? So our first example reads as follows. When chicken embryos die during incubation, hatchery producers suffer economic losses. This occurs for two reasons. Next example. When chicken embryos die during incubation, hatchery producers suffer economic losses. It occurs for two reasons. What sort of problem is emerging here? Take a moment, reflect, and then we'll look at ways to correct these two examples. All right, so the issue that emerges is that in the first two examples, there's ambiguity. We don't know if we are referring to the death of those chicken embryos or the economic losses. As a result of this ambiguity, it can lead to some misinterpretation or confusion for the readers. And that's something that we always want to avoid when communicating with our audience. So this problem can be easily solved by adding a noun. These losses, these deaths. It makes it very, very obvious to which information we are referring from that preceding sentence. So we reduce potential ambiguity. In revisiting that example that we saw earlier, we see that the authors have made use of multiple old new approaches in putting the paragraph together. So we have the use of synonyms and paraphrase. So a concept like capitalistic goals, for instance, can be reworded as economy that we work within, because the readers and the writers likely exist in a same economic framework, that of a capitalistic economy. Alternately, we can make use of that this or these plus a noun structure in order to reference information that came before. And we can also make use of that strategic repetition so that there is no confusion as to what we are referencing in our sentences. And again, that we return to this use of synonyms and paraphrase. So taking a closer look at these three options, we have, again, the strategic repetition. Most people prefer cats to dogs. Cats are preferred for several reasons. So we're taking that wording of cats and preference, prefer, preferred, and we are repeating them at the beginning of that new sentence. The next example, paraphrase or synonym use. Cats may be valued in part because of their inquisitive nature. A cat's curiosity, however, can create challenges for its owners. So inquisitive nature, another way of expressing that concept is to say something like a cat's curiosity. So the wording is quite different, but the meaning is the same. And so that's where making use of paraphrase or synonyms can still add some of that variety of expression while still following that old new information structure. Our final example, the this or these plus a noun, can be arranged as follows. It is estimated that pet ownership accounts for $2 billion in consumer spending annually. This high cost reflects the evolving relationship humans have with companion animals. So that high cost is referring to the $2 billion in annual spending. So we have three options for assembling our sentences in line with that old new information technique. All right, so that brings us to toward the close of part 2 of our 2-part literature review series. So I hope that after today's session, you are more aware of different ways for organizing literature reviews and thinking about which one is going to be most appealing for your reader. Thinking about how literature reviews are really dependent on synthesizing the research that you have undertaken, that you have read, that you have collected, and presenting it as that narrative. In doing so, you are demonstrating higher order thinking because you're able to put all those relationships together. And ultimately, you're going to create a piece of text that is more readable for your audience. And we can enhance synthesis through our writing, our style of writing. So making use of a technique like the old new information technique can also enhance the readability of our literature review. In terms of next steps, I encourage that you review a sampling of literature reviews in your field so that you can develop a stronger mental framework in terms of understanding the expectations or the conventions in your field. Consider how they are organized. Are the authors making use of car moves, for instance? How has the research been synthesized? Are there a lot of single studies being highlighted, or is there more emphasis on those those tighter examples of synthesis where things are more blended and citations are more grouped? And then also consider how the language has been used. How is language being used to reinforce synthesis? All right, so there are lots of recommended resources that you can make use of, so I certainly encourage you to explore those. And again, you won't be able to ask questions in real time, but you're always welcome to send me an email, jill.mcmillan@usask.ca. All right, have a great rest of the day. Bye.